Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining the webinar this evening. We'll be discussing how to improve newborn survival on beef and sheep farms. My name is Bruce McConaughey and I'm the Head of Industry Development at Quality Meat Scotland. Tonight we'll hear from Dr. Alex Corbishley, a Senior Lecturer in Farm Animal Health at the University of Edinburgh. Alex has worked at the university for 6 years and previously worked as a vet in Northamptonshire and Cheshire. The aim of the project is to benchmark and define the risk factors for and propose an integrated control plan to improve survival and reduce morbidity and antibiotic use in neonatal lambs and in suckler herds throughout Great Britain. The project is supported by the 3 levy boards, QMS, HCC and AHDB, who lead on it, and it's funded via the Ring Fence Fund, which is a 3-way support fund contributed to by the levy boards. As well as that, it's only possible with a huge amount of support from our academic and veterinary partners, who are all listed on one of Alex's slides a little later on. We have Rebecca from AHDB who will be posing your questions to Alex at the end, and we also have Nia Davis from HCC in the background somewhere with her camera off. So the plan of action for this evening is that Alex will take us through about a half-hour presentation, and there will be some time for questions at the end. But if you feel like asking questions as we progress, or if anything pops up that you would like a little more information on, or to pick Alex's brains, then please do put your questions in as we go along. And if there are some questions by the time we reach the halfway point, we'll pause and we'll go through some of them and see if we can answer them for you. As you see there, if you think of a question, type it into the question box at any time. It usually sits on the right-hand side of your screen, and there's a handy little picture diagram up on your screens now. If you can't see that box, you need to click the small orange arrow to open up the box, and then click the questions drop down, and you'll see where you can type the questions in. As usual, as is standard webinar practice, I'm sure you'll all be well used to it just now. You'll all be muted throughout the webinar, so you can feel free to comment to your heart's content, but we won't hear any of it. So if you do have anything that you want to say, put it in the questions box as we've described, and also use that to let us know if you're having any sort of technical difficulties, and people who are far more adept at this than I am will do their best to make sure that we can rectify that for you. The usual advice, as with everything IT, is switch it off and on again, so log out and log back in. And that's probably enough for me as a scene setting piece. So I'll hand over to Alex for the really interesting stuff.
Thanks very much, Bruce. So as Bruce said in the introduction, today's talk is based on some of the key findings of a project that was looking at newborn survival in both suckler calves and lambs, and was funded by the 3 levy boards and involved farmers across England, Scotland and Wales. So it's a pretty large project, and we only have a limited amount of time today. So I'm going to give you the headline key questions we asked during the project. I'm very happy to talk about it a bit more in the questions. And then I'll show you just some of the highlights of the messages that came through from the work that we did. The work involved both vets and farmers, and one of the things we were interested in was understanding the barriers and enablers to change in terms of improving survival. We wanted to understand what survival or mortality currently looked like in GB. We wanted to explore how current practices related to survival. And we also ran an experiment in our own flock here in Edinburgh to look at how metabolic status in ewes related to lamb survival and performance, and also to look at how antibiotic treatment of all lambs at birth affected their performance. There's another project that was funded by AHDB and the University of Edinburgh before this one started, where we've also brought some of the findings into this talk, where we were looking at the risk factors for things like assisted calvings and poor colostrum antibody absorption in suckler calves, and the 2 projects overlap quite a lot. So there was a big social sciences component that looked at interviewing farmers and vets, and we haven't really got a lot of time to go into that one today, that part of the project. But there was one sort of quote that came out of the interviews that I thought really summed up the whole subject for us. And that was this. This was from one of the farmers that was interviewed. And they said, "I just don't like losing things, and I take it really, really badly when I do. It's not about money. It's more about what about you want everything to do as well as it can. And that I felt was a really powerful quote that really demonstrated that everyone who's working with cattle and livestock and sheep, they're doing this because they want things to do well. They're internally motivated to do these things, and it's a really gutting experience when things don't go to plan. So within that context, we've been talking lots of vets about positive conversations, thinking about survival rather than talking about mortality all the time. And today we're going to be thinking about some of the things we could do and some of the messages from the study that help us to try and improve survival of lambs and calves. And I said that's sort of talking about the positives. We do need to start by thinking about the negatives a little bit. So we did benchmark lamb survival across a few hundred farms in GB. These data was collected by vet students and vets. So the vet students were on the farm recording losses, and the vets were ringing up every week. And on average, we found that in the UK, or in GB, mortality to 3 weeks to 21 days old in lambs was around 10.5% on average. And that's the red line here, and you can see the distribution of farms. And you can see some farms achieving very low levels of mortality during that 3-week period. Now, the key thing to take home from this is the vast majority of losses are taking place in the first 7 days. So 9.5% of lambs are dying in the first 7 days. And then when you go out to 21 days, the total increases to 10.4. So the vast majority of that is taking place in that first week. So that's where we're focusing. That's sort of the main area of where we need to look at to improve survival in lambs, and it gives us an idea of the big variation between farms. And of course, there are different systems here. We've got indoor and outdoor lambing, we've got upland, hill, and lowland, but it just gives us a bit of a feel for the landscape. Now, interestingly, these numbers haven't changed a lot. The study we did, in many ways, started by replicating a study that was done 20 years ago. We went further than that study did, but it just sort of illustrates that in the past 20 years, it's been difficult to make gains in those numbers. We had robust data for a much smaller number of suckler herds, but the suckler herds that we did have, there were a number that didn't have any losses at all in that first 3 weeks. And on average, losing around 6.5% of calves in the first 21 days. And again, just like with the lambs, the majority of the loss taking place in the first week, so around 5% of cows being lost in the first week of life. Again, big variation in the distribution between farms, and some achieving very, very low levels. Interestingly, there's very little data for suckler calf survival, either in the UK or internationally going back, so we don't have a very good feel for how that's changed over time. So the first thing we did in the project was we asked producers to report what their mortality was in 2018, and then we measured the mortality in 2019. The data I showed you was 2019 data. And what we've done here is just on the two plots on the left and the right, we've plotted calf and lamb mortality against calf and lamb mortality the previous year. And I put a green box around the straight line, and if performance was consistent between years, then you'd expect all the dots to be on a straight line. And you can see that some farms have achieved very similar levels of reported performance, so what the farm reported for 2018 to measured performance in 2019 for both the lambs and the suckler calves. But there's quite a few farms, actually it's the majority, where the performance between the 2 years doesn't match very well at all. Now, we did have the beast from the east. Everybody has a bad year, everybody has a good year. So there are always reasons as to why performance between years is inconsistent. But when we think about this holistically, and we take a step back and say, well, how can we improve performance in the long term? It's very hard to make gains year on year if you've got wildly different performance between years and between batches. And that's one of the challenges. Some of those challenges are outside our control. So for example, the weather. But things that are outside our control, we can hedge against. So we can hedge by lambing at different times or changing the period that we calve over, for example. But some of this variation is likely due to poor recording, and some of it's due to variation between years due to factors that are under our control. Now, thinking about recording, because some of these differences may be because the losses the previous year were not recorded accurately, there's a big difference in the level of recording that was reported in the farms we were working with. So around 2 in 3 of the beef farms and around 1 in 4 of the sheep farms were using some paper records. As you'd expect, a smaller proportion using computer records. But 2 in 3 of the sheep farms that gave us data for 2018 were giving us their best guess from memory. And actually nearly 40%, so more than 1 in 3 of the flocks had no data recording at all in terms of lamb survival. So in terms of moving towards consistency in performance and therefore getting to the point where we can start making gains year on year, the lack of data is a big barrier, and that's one of the things we explored in the social sciences part of the project. And one of the big messages was trying to focus on important metrics, meaningful metrics, and positive conversations around survival and thinking about what we can do to improve survival. So in that vein, I've split the talk up into 2 halves, one bit focusing on lambs and one bit focusing on calves. And as Bruce said, there'll be a wee pause in the middle where we can mop up any questions that have come in during the talk so that we don't end up with all the questions right at the end. So I've broken up the next few slides into sort of 4 key areas, thinking about management practices and anything that came out of our study. A big chunk on metabolic status, because there were some interesting results from the work we did with our flock. Really focusing down on colostrum and the importance of colostrum, and then sort of summarizing the findings that we had from the antibiotic work that we did in our flock. So what was really interesting on the lamb survival side of things is we asked farmers loads of questions about what you do. Do you muck out your lambing pens between every sheep? Do you put line down? Do you wear gloves when you lamb sheep? Do you metabolic profile animals? Do you feed supplements? We asked them a big broad range of questions. And there was no strong association with any single management practice in lamb survival. Now, that doesn't mean they're not important. What that's telling us is that moving towards improving lamb survival isn't going to be solved with 2 or 3 major things. We can't come up with a 5-point plan, as it were, to improve survival. So this is not like mastitis control in dairy cows. It's not like foot rot control in sheep. There are lots of little things that have to change to move towards improvements in lamb survival. There's no 5-point plan. What I think were really good messages for the industry, though, and really important things for us to recognise, is that when we looked at lamb mortality, we didn't find any association with farm size, and we didn't find any association with staff number to breeding females, so the ratio of the staff to females. And that was true for the sucklers as well. It's just we had far more sheep flocks, so we can say it with more confidence. And I think that tells us a couple of really good news messages here, is that it's not about necessarily the amount of labour. Obviously, there's a limit where you get overwhelmed, but it's about the quality of supervision, the quality of stockmanship. And we all know that, but it was interesting to see that and important to see that in the data. The other thing was, as farms got bigger, we didn't see an increase in mortality. So we had small flocks with high levels of survival, and we had large flocks with high levels of survival, and we had the converse as well. But that means we can get more efficient in terms of size and in terms of labour utilisation without becoming more wasteful in terms of lamb survival, poor animal health and welfare. So with good systems, even at scale, you can achieve comparable results to smaller systems and to systems where there's a higher level of labour input. And I think that's a really good news story for the industry. Obviously, we're constantly under scrutiny, and the public are concerned about factory farming and larger farms. And actually, this data shows that you can achieve comparable results at scale as when you're smaller. So those were positive messages, even though we didn't pin a single thing or 4 or 5 things that would improve survival. Now, as you'd also expect, mortality was more variable in outdoor lambing flocks. So this is the distribution of mortality during the time that our students were on the farms. And we can see that the outdoor flocks had a much bigger range of mortality. And you'd expect that given the influence of weather exposure, hypothermia, and things like starvation and predation on outdoor lambing flocks. The mixed flocks here, just in case any of you were wondering, these are the ones that had ewes and lambs outside during the day and were bringing them inside at night time. So just thinking about the project we did with our flock, we wanted to look at how ewe nutrition how lamb colostrum supply and how antibiotic treatment at birth impacted on the sort of life outcomes up to weaning of lamb. So which of these things really impact on whether we end up with a nice lamb looking like this or a really sickly looking lamb like that? Now, the study was run by myself and a chap called Rob Kelly, who's one of our vets there, modelling himself excellently there, blood sampling a baby lamb. And our flock is a March and April lambing lowland flock. It's about 250 ewes. They're university ewes, so they're always in good condition. They live in this palatial shed the lambing students come and look after them in, and we scan our ewes every year, and we sort them into singles, twins and triplets. And this year for this study we bled every single ewe at about just over 2 weeks before she lambed, or not before she lambed, sorry, before the lambing block started. And then at birth we monitored the singles and twins from birth all the way through to weaning. This flock never rears triplets. Triplets are always fostered on or artificially reared. Now, for this study, we didn't do any fostering on. We didn't want to interfere with the singles and twins. So all the triplets, the weakest one was taken off and artificially reared. We looked at lamb growth and we looked at disease rates up to weaning. And then every lamb either got a squirt of antibiotic in its mouth or a squirt of yellow coloured placebo. We got a few rude comments from our stockman when we told him he had to flip a coin before treating each lamb, but the lambs were completely randomised to either getting antibiotic or control, and we didn't know what they got, the stockman didn't know what they got, and actually we never unblinded the results, so it was done completely blind. And then we blood sampled the lambs at 8 to 24 hours old to measure the blood antibody levels, so the antibodies they'd absorbed from colostrum. Now, 8 hours is a little bit early, 24 hours is about right, but in this setup, they get thrown out the pens, particularly the singles, pretty quickly, and we wanted to sample them at a time which is practical if you were to ever try and do this on a commercial flock, for example. We didn't want to say, oh, we blood sampled them at 4 days old by running out into the field and catching lambs. So it was done at a time that is commercially relevant in terms of handling lambs. In terms of the ration, I should have shown you there in the picture, just in the background, you can see they're able to pop the heads through the side fence into a feed face. It's not a TMR, it's a top-dressed haylage ration. So they had good access to good quality haylage. This is the analysis for the year. We were very lucky to have haylage coming in at over 11 ME. Satisfactory protein at 13%, and as you'd expect with haylage, around 42% dry matter. And the twins and the triplets were flat fed and 18% crude protein nut, and the singles didn't get anything at all. So these are the headline results for the metabolic status, and this does get a bit technical, but I will take it in the next slide as to how that was relevant to what we found. So we measured 4 things in the sheep. We measured something called BOHB, and that measures the short-term energy balance. So I said they were all in good body condition. I don't think there was a ewe in that flock under 3, maybe the odd one at 2.5, but they were pretty well conditioned. So BOHB measures short-term energy balance, and this is this plot here, and the red line is we want everything below the red line, and as you'd expect, the energy balance results are a little bit worse in the triplets, so the BHB level is slightly higher, but there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 ewes that were in excessive negative energy balance and mobilizing body fat excessively. We were very happy with that, actually. That's a pretty small number out of 250, and what it shows us is that, yeah, you know, with the concentrate that we're getting and the 11.1 ME haylage, most of them, the vast majority of them, were pretty happy with that. We measured urea in the blood, or urea nitrogen to be specific, and this is a proxy for effective rumen degradable proteins. That's ERDP going into the rumen, and you can see here that the urea levels drop with the more lambs that ewes carrying, and the red line is our sort of cutoff as to what we think is low. Again, we were pretty happy with these. If these were ewes at grass, we'd be up at 4 or 5. They'd be very high. They'd be getting loads and loads of nitrogen in from grass. Spring grass is an excellent source of ERDP. 13% crude protein haylage. Yeah, we would expect levels a bit like this, but actually very few low, and none of them really concerningly low. The reason they're dropping with the more lambs they're carrying is probably due to less room in the rumen, so they're eating less forage there. Now, the albumin results were interesting to us. So this is quite a high health status flock. We don't have problems like liver fluke in the flock. So we were surprised to see quite a few of our ewes with low albumin results. And albumin is a measure of long-term protein balance. And we use a cutoff of 30, but we can ignore the cutoff number, to be honest. The result's more interesting when I show it to you on the subsequent slides. But essentially, the singles and the triplet carrying ewes had lower blood albumin levels than the twins. And we think what's happened here is the singles were getting no supplementary feeding. The twins were getting the same amount as the triplets, but of course the triplets have a higher demand. So what we think we've done is, even though we've rationed to what we think their protein requirements are, we've underfed them protein a bit. And it's not rumen protein we've underfed them, because we're quite happy with our urea nitrogen results. So we were surprised to see so many of our ewes with poorer long-term protein status, given that they were in excellent body condition, they were on good quality haylage, and they'd been given a nut in addition to that. And then the globulin is an indicator of inflammatory disease, and we've got 2 ewes here, single carrying ewes that have got some sort of disease problem, probably lameness or dental disease, but we can see the vast majority have got normal globulins. So these are not sheep that are under disease challenge. If they were under a high fluke burden, or they're carrying hemoncus, for example, we would expect high levels of globulin quite often. So those were the headline results of the metabolic status. And what we did is we looked at losses between scanning and 24 hours old, and then we looked at losses between 24 hours old and weaning. And as you would expect, the sort of proportion of sheep that lost a lamb increased with the more lambs they were carrying. That's kind of obvious, okay? So none of our 28 single carrying ewes lost a lamb. 14 out of 153 twin carrying ewes lost a lamb, and 16 out of 50 triplet carrying ewes. So nearly a third of our triplet carrying ewes lost at least one lamb. And we looked at a range of things, so how old the ewe was, what her body condition score was, what she was scanned as, what the birth weight was of the lambs when they were born, and the metabolic status, so the energy, the ERDP supplies, the rumen protein, the albumin, the long-term protein balance, and the globulin, the inflammatory disease. And the 2 things that came out significant, unsurprisingly, the number of lambs, we've seen that there. The more lambs you carry, the more likely you are to lose one. But really interestingly, the albumin came out, and this is the plot here. And these are the ewes that lost a lamb, and these are the ewes that didn't lose a lamb. And the ewes that lost a lamb had, on average, lower blood albumin levels than those that didn't. So there is a relationship here between long-term protein status and lamb loss. We don't know whether it's a disease that we haven't diagnosed in our flock. I think that's unlikely. I think it's more likely to be something to do with winter feeding protein levels. It doesn't appear to be short-term rumen protein related, though. And John Vipond, many of you will have seen his work. He's done some very interesting work on supplementing sheep with bypass protein. Some of the trials have worked, some of the trials haven't. And I do wonder whether this is part of the explanation. Maybe the ones where they don't work, the ewes are actually in good long-term protein balance, and the ones where bypass protein supplementation has worked is where the ewes are in poorer protein balance. So an area of ongoing work, you're sort of seeing the latest results as they stand, but there's definitely an interaction here between long-term protein status and lamb survival up to 24 hours old. So we then blood sampled all the lambs to look at their antibody levels, and this is the distribution. So you've got lamb antibody level here at the bottom and number of lambs up here on the y-axis. And this is sort of the shape you'd expect this. We actually got exactly the same shape when we looked at suckler calves. And in our flock, around 1 in 10 lambs had this antibody level of under 10, which in dairy calves is considered to be associated with increased disease. And then around 1 in 3 lambs had a result that was below 24, which in suckler calves is associated with more disease. And actually, these results are pretty much identical to what we see in suckler calves as well. So there is a substantial proportion of the flock, even in sort of the relative luxury of a teaching flock, that haven't received enough antibodies in their colostrum from their mum. Now, we found that in our study that being supplemented with colostrum didn't always sort the lambs out, didn't get their blood levels to where they needed to be. And there's a number of reasons why that might be. They might have not been given enough colostrum, they might not have been given it fast enough, or they might have been given poorer quality colostrum. And during the study where we were looking at management practices, we did ask how much colostrum folk give to lambs. And the recommended amount is 50 mils per kilo. So for a 4 or 5 kilo lamb, you'd expect to be sort of in this region here. And the vast majority of flocks are reporting feeding substantially less than the recommended amount of colostrum to lambs. So it's just a key message here is thinking about the risk of poor colostrum transfer. Antibodies from colostrum are absolutely key to that early life chance for that lamb. And a lot of us are actually not giving enough, probably in our own flock as well. So we wanted to look at what factors influence antibody levels in the lambs. Okay, so what was it that determined whether that lamb didn't absorb enough? And this doesn't tell us whether it's because the ewe didn't produce enough colostrum. It doesn't tell us whether the colostrum was poor. It doesn't tell us whether it was a weak lamb that didn't suck until it was 12 hours old. All it tells us is the lamb didn't have enough antibodies in its blood. And we looked at these different things, and the two that came out very strongly was litter size, which again, it's probably no surprise to you that a triplet born lamb is nearly 3 times more likely to have insufficient antibodies from the colostrum. That colostrum's got to go 3 ways. So that's not a surprise. Also, triplets are likely to be a bit weaker at birth and less likely to get up and suck vigorously. The one that was really quite striking for us though, remember we only had 5 ewes with the poor energy balance, the elevated BHBs, and actually even though we had a small number of ewes with quite elevated BHBs, it came out as a really strong predictor of whether lambs had insufficient antibody absorption. In fact, that's nearly 5 times or roughly 5 times more likely. So ewe energy balance we've known for decades. There's some great papers from the 80s showing how important body condition and ewe energy balance is. This project wasn't focused on energy balance, but we did have a few ewes that were in poor energy balance, and we really saw that come through as a predictor of poor antibody transfer to the lambs. So really highlighting the importance there. So what sort of things can impact ewe energy balance? Well, of course, nutrition can, and there's loads of there's loads of work and there's loads of advice out there on nutrition and rationing ewes appropriately, but also diseases can. And I just thought I'd throw this slide up. It was sent to us by a vet in practice. We do metabolic profiling up in Edinburgh, and they sent us 20 blood samples from sheep in the same field. These were twin-bearing Suffolk cross Texel ewes. They had ad lib silage as well as being at pasture, and they were given a pound of 18% crude protein nut. They also had some energy and oil tubs out. And on the bit of paper the vet sent us, they marked down which ewes were lame and which ones were not lame. And we did our normal profile, so these are all the things we looked at, and we'll just focus on the BHBs today. But this is the negative energy balance indicator. And this is the average for the group, okay? So the group of not lame sheep had an average of 0.73, which we would consider to be acceptable. Okay, there's 3 ewes with elevated levels, but they're not extreme. The lame ewes had an average of 1.6, so more than double. And the cutoff we use is 1.1, and a group average of over 1.1 we would consider to be a problem. And we've got some pretty extreme results here. We've got a sheep here well over 3, one approaching 3 here. These are sheep that are on the verge of twin lamb disease. So yes, diet has a big importance on energy balance, of course it does, but also diseases, things like lameness, are of course going to impact on intakes, and we really see it here coming through. And remember the slide I've just showed you where we looked at antibody levels in the lambs and prospects and survival for the lambs as well. So diseases as well as rationing will be impacting on these things. We then looked at the factors influencing performance of the lambs from 24 hours old. Now, luckily for the lambs and the stockmen, but not so luckily for us, lamb mortality was particularly good this year, so it was down at 4.1%. That's a bit lower than we were expecting, and fewer than 3% of the lambs actually needed any treatment for anything at all. So we didn't find any association with anything with lamb death or treatment, but then probably not surprising given how good a year it was. We did look at growth rate, and this is the distribution of growth rates. This is daily live weight gain to weaning, and the mean for the flock was 0.3 kilos a day. And the top third were doing 350 grams per day on average. So the top third lambs, their average was this green dotted line. Now the bottom third were averaging 260 grams a day. So this is the red dotted line. So we were interested to say, what's what determines whether a lamb is below this red line, so under 260 grams a day, when our flock is averaging 300? And not really to our surprise, but really powerful coming through there, poor colostrum antibody absorption was associated with being one of these poor growing lambs. And it's a nearly 5-fold increased chance of being one of these poor performers if you haven't had enough antibody. So we can draw a straight line here from ewe energy balance, from ewe diseases, straight through to lamb antibody uptake and then subsequent lamb performance. And again, we looked at oral antibiotics and the impact on treatment and growth rates, and there was absolutely no impact on oral antibiotic treatment at all on anything that we looked at in the flock. Now, this is a flock with watery mouth. It does have problems with watery mouth, not so much this year, low levels this year at 4.1% of overall mortality, and some of that would have been watery mouth mortality. But what it illustrates is that you can achieve performance, or excellent performance, without oral antibiotics, and also using oral antibiotics doesn't give you any kind of growth rate advantage, over and above not having had them. And that was completely randomized. We didn't even know which group of lambs had had the antibiotics or not when we did the analysis. So if you do have some questions, if you make sure Rebecca's got them now, because we'll have a pause after this slide. I've just tried to sum up a few messages. Of course, there are loads of things we can do, and in the plan we've sort of pulled together based on this project, it's about 60 or 70 different things you could do around lambing time, and that really needs to be tailored to the flock. But some of the messages I think that have come out of the work we've done recently, reinforcing messages, of course, that we've heard from the industry over the recent years. But what could you do tomorrow morning after this webinar? Well, you could definitely make sure you've analysed your forage and making sure you're tailoring the energy and protein supplementation to your use based on forage quality. I would definitely recommend not trying to feed twin and triplet carrying ewes forages that are under 10 megajoules of ME. Intake's really important. You saw the impact there of having 3 lambs in the abdomen on the ERDP intakes of those ewes, so ensuring sort of a minimum feed space of 15 centimetres per ewe if they're getting ad-lib access to their forages. We talked about diseases here and the impact potentially for things like liver fluke on albumins. So making sure you're taking some fecal samples for worm egg counts if things like fluke or haemoncus are possibilities in your flock. And then making sure that other diseases such as lameness in particular are well controlled. Fast forwarding, some of you will be lambing now, although if you're lambing now, you're probably not in this webinar right now, but some of you are due to start lambing very shortly. Some of you maybe not until a bit later. Things to consider, maybe doing some metabolic profiling 3 weeks before lambing to see what the energy and protein status of your use is like. Moving towards avoiding routine antibiotic use. Now, talk to your vet about doing this, because if there is a problem on the farm, then simply pulling the antibiotics is quite a high risk strategy. What you want to look at are the risk factors on the farm. Can you address those? Can you start to move towards targeted use? So maybe just focusing on triplets or weak twins initially, building up the confidence in that you've addressed the risk factors and working towards removing antibiotics entirely. Really focus on things like yard and pen hygiene. We'll look at the cattle data in a minute, but not waiting until things look visibly soiled before bedding down. There's some really interesting data that's come forward on the sucklers on that. And then in terms of colostrum, we saw that survey data, we saw the data from our own lambs in our flock. Any weak or hungry lambs, or anything you've lambed, because anything you've lambed will be weaker. Making sure that it's getting supplemented with 50 mils per kilo. So that's 250 mils for a 5 kilo lamb of used colostrum as soon as possible after birth, and certainly within 6 hours. So I was going to take a pause there, Rebecca. You've turned your camera on, so it looks like you've had a few questions.
Yeah, we've got a couple of questions so far, so I'll just get on with them. So the first question was based around the mortality figures. So are the mortality figures based on lambs born alive?
So yes, so all of the data we collected with the vet students and the lambing students, sorry, with the vet students and the vets were based on lambs born alive. So we took down daily sheets, and we actually took down all the lambs that were born and then how many were lost after that point.
Great, thank you. How do you know how much colostrum they've had?
Well, you don't, do you, in terms of actual volumes? So in terms of weak lambs, it's about identifying them early so you can give them all the colostrum that they need early. For ones that have sucked, you don't know. It's very hard to predict. But if you don't think they've had enough, topping them up is certainly a good idea. Obviously, lambs that are hungry, but what we're learning more and more from the guys that have done the behavioural work is actually you can spot the lambs and the calves. We'll get onto calves later, but you can spot the ones that are weak, that are unlikely to get up and be sucking within an hour or two, and you really need to be targeting those so that they get the full amount as quickly as possible. Trying to estimate what a lamb has sucked at 3 or 4 hours is really, really hard.
Okay, great. Were the lambs in the lowest third for growth those with lowest birth weights, or was there no association between birth weight and subsequent growth rates?
Really good question, really good question. So Rob looked at that and it really surprised me. There was no association between birth weight and subsequent birth weight. Some lambs were born small and grew like stink. Some lambs were born small and stayed small, and the corollary was true of the larger lambs.
Great. What do you do if your forage is under 10 megajoules of ME?
It's a real challenge for twins and triplets. If you can get forage in that's better and target it towards particularly the triplets, then doing that now, if you can do it, is certainly recommended. If it's under that, you're really looking at feeding high levels of concentrate, probably feeding 3 times a day to safely get enough in. And if things are getting really desperate, you may be looking at pouring molasses onto your forages as well. Definitely want to talk through with your veterinary nutritionist.
Great, thank you. Questions are pouring in now, so I'll just get to a couple more and then we might have to pick them up at the end.
Okay.
So, when using artificial colostrum for lambs, how can you tell if it's going to be good enough quality?
Yeah, so artificial colostrum is a real problem because unless they've gone to the lengths of getting it licensed as a medicine, and maybe things will change post-Brexit now and they'll be able to put more labelling on, but they're really not allowed to say how much is in there if they haven't licensed it. And to my knowledge, no one has actually gone to that extent. I may be wrong, so if there's anyone here from a company that has, I apologize to you. But to my knowledge, they're not allowed to publish what's in there. The vast majority of replacers don't contain enough in one sachet for a lamb. So the message is, if you can get extra colostrum off milky ewes, particularly ones with a single, and store it down, freeze it on the farm, that is by far preferable. If you're using replacers, be aware that single sachet doesn't give a lamb everything it needs. So if you can get it, whatever used colostrum you can, that is preferable.
Great, I'll just go for one more. So with triplets, would it be better to take away the strongest lamb?
That's a good question, isn't it? So I think I need to have a wee ponder on that one, because yeah, we've in our flock, we've always taken away the weakest one because it's always either been artificially reared or fostered on. But it is a fair point. If you want one that's going to have a decent chance when it's being fostered, maybe the strongest one is the better one. I guess the flip side of that, it is a higher risk strategy if a strong lamb doesn't adopt on well. I don't know. Maybe we'll get a few thoughts on that during the talk, and some folk might come up with some other ideas. Really good question, not one I'd really thought about.
Okay. I think we're okay to move on just now then.
Okay.
Thank you.
Grand. Okay, well, we'll move on to the suckler calves then. So similar sort of theme, thinking about nutrition and body condition, management of cows before calving, monitoring cows around the time of calving, and then really back onto that colostrum message again. So I've shown this slide in the past, I've nicked it from other talks, but it's a really important one. And what we're aiming with our suckler cows is to have them calving down at between 2.5 and 3 at calving. And there are other AHDB webinars out there talking about that in a lot more detail. We don't have time to really drill down into that today. But cows under condition score 2 have difficulty calving and poor calf figure. And the same is true for obese calves born to obese cows as well. The key thing here, though, is do not try to change body condition in the last month of pregnancy. In the last month of pregnancy, we need cows to be meeting their current energy and protein requirements. Now, Rachel Bragg, who's one of the vets who works with myself in Edinburgh, she's been looking at the risk factors for calving difficulties in calves that were born naturally and were alive at about 4 or 5 days old, okay? So she's not looking at calves that have had a cesarean, she's not looking at calves that died within the first couple of days of life. But what was really striking in her data was if we look at the proportion of calves that needed assistance at birth, those born to thin cows, so 1.5 or 2, particularly the ones at 1.5, were substantially more likely to need some help. So 3/4 of calves born to thin cows needed assistance if they were body condition score 1.5, and over 1/4 of calves born to cows that were in body condition score 2 needed some assistance. And you can see that that reduces down to sort of cows that are between sort of 2.5 to 3. There is a health warning with this. Please don't read too much into the fat cows. There were very, very few fat cows in this study. There were no obese cows. Well, 4.5 is obese, but I think there were about 4 cows in this group, and there were no 5 out of 5 cows. So this study does not rule out being obese as a problem at calving time, and some of those calves will have died, some of those calves will have needed cesareans. So please don't read too much into this side. But this is a really powerful message. Cows that were too thin were at a substantially increased risk of needing help at calving time. So it's not just fat cows, it's also thin cows that are at risk of calving difficulties. So thinking about nutrition, we need to be focusing on meeting cows' current needs at calving, okay? It depends on the size of the cow, but we're looking at around 90 to 100 megajoules probably. The protein, current advice, if you pick up most handbooks, is talking about a 9% crude protein level. In our experience, we think that's an absolute minimum. Some herds can get sufficient protein into cows at 9% crude protein if the intakes are very good. Many struggle and need to be targeting 10 to 11% crude protein. This really hangs on intakes. In terms of minerals, we see lots of weird things with suckler cow minerals, and really they need to be getting fed between 100 to 150 grams of a suckler cow, sorry, I said dry cow, dry suckler cow, not necessarily a dairy mineral. And the reason for that is they're higher in magnesium and they're lower in calcium. I'm not here advocating we feed dry suckler cows 0% calcium minerals like in some dairy herds, but generally making sure that the mag's a bit higher and the calcium's a bit lower is important to helping to avoid slow calvings and also clinical staggers as well. And then after that, once you've got these basics lined up, it's all about intake. So is the forage fresh and palatable? Can we avoid group and ration changes? I'll show you some data about group changes in a minute, and avoiding overcrowding to make sure the intakes are kept where they need to be. And you can feed suckler cows on pretty average quality forages all the way through. They don't necessarily have to be supplemented with additional feeds, provided you're able to meet these baselines with your forages. So this slide looks at some of the things that came out of our survey, and we asked the farmers that completed the survey whether they moved their cows around calving time, and some didn't tell us anything. They just didn't answer the question. But the herds that reported moving cows before calving, it didn't say exactly when, but it's sort of in the sort of week before calving, reported higher levels of mortality than the herds that reported moving the cow and calf after calving. Now that was really powerful for us because we put that question in after reading some Canadian research which showed that actually moving animals in the run up to calving increased mortality. And there's been similar work in dairy showing that group changes in the run up to calving also affects calf survival in dairy herds. So we don't know what it is. We don't know whether it's feed intakes. We don't know whether it's just disruption and stress on the animal. We don't know, but we do know that moving cows in that last few days prior to calving does increase the risk of losing a calf. The other thing we asked, and I mentioned this in passing in the sheep part of the talk, was we asked when they were bedding down. A load of people didn't answer the question. But the 3 questions that we did get answered well was whether they bedded daily, weekly, or when the cows looked dirty. And again, the herds that reported bedding down when the cows looked dirty had substantially higher mortality rates than those that were bedding down on a regular basis. Now, you could say maybe those were just unlucky farms, or maybe they were farms that had other poor management practices. But interestingly, this is a really important thing when you look at mastitis risk in dairy cows. Again, cows that are allowed to get visibly dirty or where the bedding is visibly dirty are at massively increased risk of mastitis. Therefore, it's not surprising that you're going to see a similar trend in calves where the hygiene of that calving environment is so important. So the key message here is have a regular bedding regime that keeps the animals looking clean all the time, rather than waiting until they look dirty before bedding them down. So Rachel's work looked at other risk factors associated with calving. These will not surprise you. They've all been reported before, and anyone who's been in a herd for more than about 6 months will recognize these. So, you know, being born a twin, you're much more likely to need calving. That's sort of nearly 40% of calves that were twins. Being born to a heifer, again, nearly 40% of calves born to heifers needed some help. And being male, okay, they're generally a bit bigger, aren't they? So some of these things you can do something about. Obviously, most herds don't know whether they've got male or female calves on board. That's a pretty sharp shooting scanner if you're getting them sexed at scanning. However, most all will know whether it's a heifer or a cow, and a reasonable proportion now will know whether they've got cows with twins on board because they've been scanning at that sort of 50-60 day time where you can spot twins quite easily. So fast forwarding now to the calves being born, we have also looked at the risk factors for poor colostrum antibody absorption. Again, being a twin comes through really strongly. Again, your mum being a heifer comes through really strongly. Having a difficult calving, you know, probably, you know, being a twin or being a heifer is you're more likely to have a difficult calving. So these are probably all related. And then if you've been given help by the stock team, you know, to find the teat, if you've been fed dams colostrum with a bottle or a tube, or if you've been fed artificial colostrum, are all risk factors as well. And what this tells us is that we're really good at spotting calves that need help. You know, the fact that calves that have had help are at risk of not having had enough antibodies says that the ones that need help are being identified, but they're not getting that help either early enough or they're not getting enough of that help. And again, we asked the same question that we asked the sheep guys. We asked the same in terms of colostrum supply to calves. The current recommendation is 10% of body weight, which for most of the calves in our study is around 4 kilos, 4 litres of colostrum for a 40 kilo calf. We weighed, I think it was 1,000 calves across 83 farms in 2018, and you know, very few had an average calf weight of under 40 kilos. And most herds we were talking to were reporting feeding volumes of under 3, and with 2 being the commonest amount. So it's maybe not surprising that having help with colostrum was a risk factor for not having enough antibodies, because we're not giving them enough. So practical advice, which calves to supplement, you know, how do we spot them? Well, this was some really nice Canadian work. It's 3 years old now, but it's still a really nice piece of work. And they looked at the proportion of calves that didn't get up and suck on their own within, I think it was 4 hours of calving. So those that had no assistance at calving, that had a strong suck reflex, over 90% of them got up and sucked. Only 8% of them didn't get up and suck within 4 hours. If they had a weak suck reflex, that however jumped to 3/4 of them didn't get up and suck. Those that had an easy assist, 1 in 4 of them didn't get up and suck. So even though they hadn't had a particularly rough time when they were assisted, 1/4 of the calves were not up and sucking. And if they had a weak suck reflex, that was nearly all of them. Those of them that had a rough calving, 2/3 of them never got up in decent time. Half of them, even if they had a strong suck reflex, were not up and sucking within 4 hours. And then 98%, as good as 100% of them, were not up and sucking. So what's the key message from all the work that we've done and looking in the literature? Anything you help to be born, or anything that you look at, and if you put your thumb in its mouth, you're a bit worried about it, and you put your thumb in its mouth, and it's not sucking well at 10 minutes old, it needs 3 to 4 litres, so 10% of body weight of colostrum immediately after calving. And you've already caught this cow, you've already calved her. Now, she might be evil, she may kick, and you may have to get colostrum from another cow if it's not safe to do, but you know, this is an animal that has already been caught and a calf that you have already handled, and it's very clear from the evidence that these just need to be given the colostrum. You know, they're not, a substantial proportion of them are not going to be getting up and sucking colostrum on their own fast enough. So again, just with the sheep, I've tried to do something similar. Again, of course, there are 60, 70, 80 different things you could all be thinking about right now. But some of the things that have come out of the studies we've been doing, and again, reinforcing things we've been thinking about recently, is tomorrow morning, what could you do? Well, you could go out and body condition score your cows. And any that are thin, so under 2.5 out of 5, you know, provided they're not going to calve in the next week or two, you know, get them grouped up, feed them some additional food, try and get their condition improved. If you've scanned and you know you've got twin carrying cows, put them in with the thin ones. There's a really interesting herd up north in Scotland that SAC have been working with, and they calve, I think, 18% twins. 80% of their cows calve twins every year, and it's not a disaster for them. You know, twins there do well, and it's because they manage them, they scan for them, they manage them separately, and you look at their calves reared percentage, it's just phenomenal because of the twins coming through. Yes, it is more work, but I'm not saying we necessarily all go down that road, but twins don't have to be a disaster, I think is the point. Check your forage quality. Again, we can get away with feeding poorer quality forages to suckler cows, of course we can, but they do need to have a reasonable level of energy and protein. If they're not going to meet the current requirements of our cows, then we do need to supplement them. So make sure that you're prepared to ration them and prepared to supplement them if needed. I'm not here saying that we need to be steaming cows up, suckler cows up before calving, but if the forages don't meet the energy and protein requirements for the last month, make sure that we're able to supplement them. And bed cows regularly, don't wait until they look dirty. We've shown, and the Canadians have shown, that has a big impact on survival. So things to think about around calving time: pay particular attention to our heifers and our thin cows and our twin carrying cows. In fact, if they're grouped off separately, then they're going to be a pen you need to take particular attention to, because they're much more likely to need help. Don't move the cows before calving. That has now, I'm pretty convinced that that's a risk for calves being lost. And just don't risk colostrum supply. So if you've calved a cow, strip off all of her colostrum and feed it to the calf using a bottle or stomach tube. And if you can't get 4 litres off that cow, then supplement that calf with colostrum from another cow of known good disease status. So those are a few messages from today. Just a couple of slides just to wrap up with before we can go back to questions. We do need to think as an industry where we go forward, and I talked at the start about performance, and we do need to think about some of the barriers to recording and some of the barriers to discussing performance. And it was really clear in the discussions that the social scientists did that it's really hard to talk about mortality and losses, and it can have a big effect on folk. And if we can move towards a positive discussion around survival and try and get the data we need to start driving that discussion, then hopefully we can start to agree targets for improvement. But what's clear is that practical improvements, so things that are actually achievable on the farm, need to be farm specific. I can't give you a slide with 5 things that you can all do tomorrow morning that's all going to get you an extra 3 or 4% lambs or calves. But what we need to do is look at the risk factors on individual farms, so working with your vets, working with your advisors, and then tailoring interventions and potentially targets. In the discussions, a lot of folk that the social scientists talked to really did stress that they felt the targets needed to be specific and achievable to their farm, and tailoring that to the individual needs. So we have a plan for that. This is something we're going to be talking to vets about in the summer, hopefully when we're allowed to meet face-to-face and to start doing face-to-face training and events again. Maybe that's overly optimistic, but I forever remain optimistic. To really think about some of the key drivers of lamb and calf survival, so nutrition, shelter, infection, colostrum, breeding, and that all hangs around a coherent farm team where we've got well-trained and motivated guys. And on all the farms we worked on, we were just completely gobsmacked by the commitment and the work of the team on these areas. So this is something we'll be talking to the vets about, and a sort of a plan to tailor things towards the farm. And we can't do everything all at once, but there are 3 or 4 things that most farms can identify specific to them that will help them to improve survival. I do need to acknowledge the substantial work that's been done by colleagues, a lot of people at the University of Edinburgh and Liverpool. Emily Gascoigne, in particular down at Synergy Farm Health, has been an absolute star with this project, as well as at University of Nottingham. And this was funded by you guys from across all 3 countries and through the 3 levy boards. I did mention some of the things that came through the social scientists there in terms of how difficult it is dealing with neonatal losses and how we want to focus on positive discussions. But there are obviously times when things get really hard, so there is help out there for folk that need it. And really, I think that's it. Back over to Rebecca for any questions that have come in.
Great, thank you. Yeah, there's some good questions coming in. So there's one just looking back to the lambs, if we can. So were the growth rates to weaning, and if so, what age was that?
So they were to weaning, and the weaning date was, I think, the last week of July. I can't remember the exact date that it was, Rebecca, but they would have all been slightly different age because you know, they lambed over 4 or 5 weeks. But yeah, it was a fixed date at the end of July.
Okay, so what breeds of cows were used in the study? So for example, Limb Cross Blue versus Angus Cross dairies are quite different forms of, in terms of management when maintaining body condition score.
Yeah, so we worked with, well, there were 2 different projects actually, but in the project where we were looking at body condition and calving, it was 83 different farms. And I think the one thing we all know about suckler farming is there are probably as many different suckler systems and genetic backgrounds as there are suckler farms. We did divide them up into continental and sort of native breeds. Didn't really see that as a big effect in terms of what we were looking at. I'm going to get into trouble now. The Charolais came out as having harder calving difficulty. I don't think that surprises anybody, but that was the only breed that really came out on that. Yes, managing body condition is of course different depending on the genetic background, but if you're body condition scoring your cows, you can monitor that and you can tailor what you're doing according to that. And I did caveat when we're talking about the energy and protein requirements, yes, that will vary depending on body weight. Unfortunately, unless someone corrects me, I'm not aware of any beef suckler specific energy and protein requirements. If you pick up the nutrition manual, it says a suckler cow is in late pregnancy is considered the same as a dairy cow in late pregnancy. So maybe there's some project work to be done there. But yes, if you're body condition scoring your cows, you can tailor what you're doing around the differences in your genetic background. It's a really good point.
Okay, so do you have any information on what leads to poor suckle reflex? Is there any impact from cow nutrition?
So there's not a lot of work on that. One of the biggest factors is going to be acidosis. And what I mean by acidosis are calves that have had a slow calving and they've built up acid in the blood because they've been getting low in oxygen. And that's certainly known to be a big impact on suck reflex. And the slower the calving, and if you've had to give it any assistance, the higher the acid levels in the blood and therefore the poorer the suck reflex. So the main driver is going to be you know, stress at calving time, low oxygen levels leading to more acid in the blood. Now, of course, nutrition will interact with that. If you've got your magnesium wrong and you've got a slow calving problem, then you're going to have calves being born that are acidotic. But I'm not aware of a direct relationship from what you feed to the calf itself.
Okay, is giving colostrum by tube as effective as feeding it by bottle?
Yeah, really good question. I'm going to slightly dodge it in a little way in that bottle feeding is probably better, but if you're busy and you can't get you don't have time to get 4 litres into a calf, then you're better off getting 4 litres in with a tube. So it's more important that it gets the 4 litres regardless of whether you give it by bottle or tube. If you have got the time, then generally folk would prefer the bottle. And there is some evidence that that they will take it up a bit better, but it's more important the volume rather than how it's given.
Okay, so is there evidence that that if a cow produces a weak calf 1 year, she'll do so again? i.e., can we select for cows that need limited intervention if managed well? Is there a genetic component that can be selected for minimising labour need?
There is almost certainly a genetic component. We just probably haven't focused on it enough. And I think there are probably 2 different parts to that genetic component. I think there's the calving ease, which is obviously a key thing we can select on. And one thing we did find, I didn't present it today, but very small proportion of the folk we worked with were selecting on EBVs at all. So, you know, going for cows with a good indirect calving ease and going for bulls with a good direct calving ease is going to give you more vigorous calves because they've had an easier birth. But calf vigor itself will almost certainly have a genetic component.
Okay, why do you think thin cows require more assistance?
Really good question. We don't know. we have lots of hypotheses. So some of them will have a disease problem, won't they? Some will be thin because there's something wrong with them. And whatever is wrong with them is probably also meaning that they have difficulties calving. I think also what we call uterine inertia, so basically they get tired very quickly, is almost, certainly part of the picture there as well. So some of the cows will be sick, some of them are probably just weaker and get fatigued faster than the cows that are in appropriate body condition.
Okay, we've got a few more questions if you're happy to carry on for 5 minutes, Alex.
I'm happy as long as you guys are, that's grand.
Yeah, that's fine. So did you treat the navel with anything in the study?
I presume this is our sheep study. So yes, we used iodine in our study. For the cattle side of things, then it would have been a big mix of different practices because we were on lots of different farms.
Okay. Do calves need access to drinking water as well as milk?
Yeah, so I would always have drinking water available. Of course, a newborn calf on the day it's born isn't going to start drinking, but it's a requirement that we give them all, and they will start to explore it. So yes, definitely.
Okay. I think we're kind of at the end there. Really, there's a few quite specific questions that we'll maybe come back to people individually if that's okay. So yeah, I think that's us at the end, really.
Right. Thank you very much, Rebecca, for keeping us on track and getting all these questions out. I can see they're coming in thick and fast as we progress through that talk there. It's really good. Just before we round up, there will be a feedback form which pops up when you leave the webinar tonight, and it would be really, really appreciated if you could fill it out and give some suggestions for any future webinars you might want to see. So it falls to me to do the thank yous. So first and foremost, thank you very much to Alex for that really interesting talk and for your time this evening. Thank you to everybody at home, everybody listening, everybody that's logged on tonight. It's not very nice weather out there, so where else would you rather be? The presentation and the questions have been recorded and will be available on the AHDB Beef and Lamb YouTube channel, and a link will be circulated, I presume, at some point. So thanks again, and have a good evening, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Bruce.